Welcome everyone to Residency Hot Topics. Really appreciate you being here on a Tuesday evening. We are covering a very exciting topic, I believe, foot and ankle innovations, covering new medical technology that every PT should know. And luckily, we have two of the world's best biomechanical researchers to take us through it, Dr. Chris Neville and Dr. Howard Hillstrom. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everybody. Chris Neville to start here. We're going to do intros. I'm going to turn it over to Howard in just a second here. But, welcome, everybody. I'll let you, Howard, if you want to just go to the next slide, I'll just preview everybody here. And I would just start with, Ben and I go way back. I think I can say that in that we worked, I don't know, geez, it's maybe almost 10 years ago. Has it been that long? But on a few different initiatives through the APTA. At the time, I was president of the Foot and Ankle SIG. And so, yeah, that's how we got connected. And I set that all up as just kind of a background to the pathway I've taken in my career. And it's sort of pertinent to the talk tonight. And so really looking forward to hearing Howard Hillstrom as well. We sort of have connected throughout our careers working in the foot and ankle area. And so you'll see some of that. And then last, you guys were really looking forward to the questions. This is meant to be an interactive kind of evening. So maybe next slide here. I'll tell you just a little bit of background. I mean, I think everybody has a story that brings you to innovation, but to talk about entrepreneurship a little, I teach an entrepreneurship class now. And I really, and I won't go too far and I won't take this too long, but I think way back to even my growing up in the restaurant business, I learned sort of efficiency and economics. And I think the restaurant business and customer service and all of those I look back now and I see those as these critical kind of elements that I gained even way back when I wasn't thinking about it. And so, then fast forward, through my career, I became a PT, worked in that area, went back, got a PhD, ran a lab, was a scientist, went back into education. I did a lot of teaching and really became a clinician scientist, right? Where I was running a lab, I was seeing patients in clinical trials, I was teaching, I was doing a lot of those things. And now, I've brought myself over to this sort of director role. I now direct industry research for the university. And I oversee kind of an IP portfolio, an intellectual property portfolio of a couple hundred, disclosures that are patents that we look to pursue into innovations or new medical products that we're looking to commercialize. And there's a team that kind of does that, and it's really a diverse team of attorneys and IP professionals and of course, clinicians that come up with all these great ideas across an academic medical center. And then, last, it's really patients, right? And it's really about how patients use, think about, provide feedback, test all of these devices in the commercialization kind of pathway. And so I think Howard and I had actually recently, many years ago, I think we'd crossed paths at different conferences, sort of working in the foot and ankle space. But recently, I served as a customer discovery person that Howard had reached out to get insight on a medical device. And so I thought this is too perfect to sort of bring Howard in today to talk about just kind of this innovation pathway or this pathway of discovery of new medical devices, especially in the foot and ankle space. And so let me turn it over to Howard for a sec here to give his little bio, and then I'll jump back in with a little bit on innovation before we go on.
Sure. Thanks for the kind words, Chris. So my training is I'm an engineer, electrical and biomedical engineer, and my doctorate's in biomedical engineering. But I have been directing human movement laboratories for really pretty much all of my professional life since my PhD training. But I want to share since Chris shared his origins, I got to share mine, and it's kind of humorous. It goes back to when most little kids were pulling a red wagon. My red wagon was my mom's vacuum cleaner. And what I love to do is take it apart, put it back together, take it apart, put it back together, and I reverse the polarity of the motor so that when she turned it on, it would blow the dirt in the drapes. So everyone kind of knew when I was growing up that I was going to be a scientist, and I just followed the plan, and here I am. The entrepreneurial side came a little later, and my better half is also a PhD in biomedical engineering, and she also has her MBA, and she spun a company off called Biomed Consulting, which produces biomedical devices from designs and concepts of ours. And I'm going to share with you one all about foot and ankle function today as we go through the presentation, because it'll kind of give you a good example of the struggles of trying to do entrepreneurial work and where you get stuck and what you have to think about. So let's move on to the next slide. I know,
Yeah,
Chris.
we shared these just some educational goals on sort of the focus of today and what we thought you guys could take away from it all, sort of what we were thinking about as we put it together. And so I'm going to talk just real quickly about entrepreneurship, and sort of thinking about medical technologies kind of moving through the pathway of commercialization, in especially focused on foot and ankle. Um, and and then we'll sort of apply this to Dr. Hillstrom's concept, which we'll sort of use as an example to sort of walk through that. So next slide. So I'll set the stage here just a little bit, and that I think a lot about entrepreneurship across an academic medical center, and just as a little bit, if these are not familiar terms to you, although just to give you a little context, I think most people are familiar with entrepreneurship, this idea of starting a company, or what do you need to do and to overcome challenges that are to advance a product or advance a technology or a company, right? A service. But intrapreneurship has been a growing kind of conceptual framework around sort of taking all of those same conceptual skills and approaches, but then bringing them into large organizations. And certainly, academic medical centers, hospitals, clinical sites that many of you are working in now or will work in the future. These are all, in most cases, these large organizations that really still need lots of entrepreneurial kind of activity, but in many cases it's sort of brought into the guidelines and the sort of rules or structure of a larger organization. But again, there's a lot of overlap here. And so two of those pieces that overlap we can sort of talk about are innovation and really risk taking, right? We want, risk taking is a really good thing. We need organizations to think about, new ways to do things, right? Which means taking risks, right? In many ways. And so we have to think about how do we control that risk, but at the same time, how do we allow people the space to be able to take risks in sort of really safe environments or environments that we can support. So next slide. And so if we think about innovation, and I think this has been a helpful, this matrix, right? I'm going to present to you just really quick here, has been helpful to just sort of conceptualize different kinds of innovation. And so I'm going to walk you through this just a little bit, and please feel free. I think typically as this is presented, you can have a fair bit of pushback in sort of saying, well, wait a second, I'm not sure I believe, I'm not sure I see that way. But let's walk through it just a little bit and then see how you think about it as we go on. So let me start in the lower left corner here with basic research. And if you're looking at the axes here, so on the y-axis, how well is the problem defined? So we might think of this is are we trying to solve a patient problem or a clinical problem or a medical problem? Do we know what the problem is that we're trying to address? And then on the x-axis there is what are the tools, like what are the skills, what are the approaches, what, in a basic science lab, these are referred to as assays or like tests, right? So what are the the skills you need in a lab or the skills you need on a team or the skills you need in a company or resources, right? That are used to solve that you need to solve a problem. And in basic research, and again, this is where many basic researchers will push back on this. According to this, neither of those are too well defined. Now, many times a researcher is going to push back and say, well, look, at anyone who's run an NIH lab is going to tell you that we actually have to have a pretty well defined, set of tools, and they have to be really well validated. And, so there's a fair bit of work and rigor that goes into, sort of the domain in which we work in. And that's absolutely true. Um, but I also think it's a space in which we allow ourselves the opportunity to address questions and try to answer questions in ways that we don't know how we're going to do it. And we learn new skills, we develop new things in our labs to try and solve problems that we haven't yet thought of or we haven't yet figured out how to solve. So I think that's the kind of way in which you define that basic research in that area. And then going diagonally to sustaining innovation, you sort of have the opposite, right? Where the problem is really well defined, the way in which the tools you need in which to solve that problem are also pretty well defined. The sort of classic example of this is at the Apple company, right? The Apple innovations, right? They do a really good job of doing sustaining innovation, right? Every year we get a new app update, and every 3 years there's a new, or every year there's new phones that come out. And these tend to be very, iterative steps that continue to solve problems that are well defined, that they know from their consumers in ways that they know that they're taking these steps towards solving. So that's a really good, those are sort of the examples of sustaining innovation. So now if we look at the other two, if I go down to disruptive innovation, this tends to be, areas in which, again, the tool exists, but it's usually applied to solve a problem that's sort of new, that someone hasn't thought of yet, or we haven't thought to use that tool for that problem. So the current example that's happening really all the time right now is AI, right? I just sat through a meeting, I think yesterday, where we had a startup company that had developed sort of an AI tool for developing novel drugs. So these are novel molecules, and people have said this is a great application for AI. But what's really interesting is as we got into it, they really were just using this AI engine to iteratively create new molecules, but they really had no idea what they were going to do, right? They had no idea what the drug was going to be used for, how it was going to be used, what it was going to target, anything like that, right? So they were really kind of using a technology, but they didn't really know what the problem was. So it's very disruptive, right? It's kind of a really shiny thing, and it can be really disruptive, and especially if you can find really good targets, it can be really disruptive. Um, so that's disruptive innovation. And then on the other corner, breakthrough innovation, sort of the opposite again, where now we really have something new, like a new way of going after a problem that many of us have had before, right? So cloud-based software was an example of a breakthrough innovation, right? Software for years and years, you went to the store and you bought a disk, and that's how you came home and loaded it on your computer, and that's how you got software. And the idea of putting that so that it's just sort of available to anybody at any time just changed the way in which the consumer, right, solves this problem of needing software with a totally new technology. So again, I provide this only as a sort of it maybe even philosophical, but in some ways, hopefully a constructive kind of way of thinking about innovation in lots of different ways. And by no means do I ever think that any innovation sits in any one of these. I think they usually move throughout different parts of them in different phases of their life, if we think about it that way. And so again, it's not meant to be restrictive, but rather just a way of sort of thinking about how is any given innovation used. And sometimes that's really helpful as we think about what it is we need to do with it. So at this point, I'll go on to the next slide. and sort of turn this over to Howard now to sort of use again, this sort of came across my desk, and Dr. Hillstrom's really been a leader in this field for many years, but it's been really great to sort of see a real life example of a foot and ankle innovation as I've seen it kind of go through. And so I thought we could use that as a great example of sort of seeing a medical technology kind of from the beginning and where it's at now. And so I'll turn this over to Howard Hillstrom, and looking forward to the pathway.
Thanks. Thanks, Christopher. Feel free to jump in anytime you like. Okay, so um, first thing that's obvious is that rarely anymore is science or innovation done in a vacuum. It's almost always done in a team. And that's why you see me credit the team, because without the physical therapists, the um, foot and ankle orthopedic surgeons, podiatric physicians, and engineers working together, we wouldn't have been able to pull off this innovative idea. The other thing that we typically do is disclose things just so that you're aware of any potential biases. Remember, I said that my wife and I spun off a company to help produce this innovation. We have at Hospital for Special Surgery, we have an innovation division, and they have staff with different backgrounds in pharma and devices and obviously orthopedic related issues, because we're in an orthopedic health science center. Um, but it's important to note that 7 of us were co-inventors of this technology. It's already been patented in Australia and has been invited for a unitary European patent, which was applied for this year, and UK and Spain individually, because they are separate from the European Union. And it's pending in the USA and Japan. Um, the company Biomed Consulting is run by my better half, Raj, and I'm the CTO. We've been funded by the National Institute of Health with a particular group from arthritis and musculoskeletal disease, NIAMS, with a program designed for enhancing innovation and encouraging and helping develop and foster innovation, called the SBIR program, which stands for Small Business Innovative Research. And we had received a phase 1 grant to do what I'm about to show you, which is a device to measure first ray mobility. So that project was funded. And then in addition, on the side, the surgeon in chief at HSS funded a second study related to this to help our foot and ankle surgeons look at different bunionectomies through the lens of the measurements of structure and function that I'm going to show you. So that's kind of cool to see the application going on while you're also developing the technology. So we'll talk a little bit about foot structure and the 3 different measurement systems that we've developed over the years to measure first ray mobility, arch height index, which is a great way to document foot type of an individual, and first metatarsal phalangeal joint flexibility, an obvious way of assessing hallux rigidus and osteoarthritis. And then we'll talk about foot function, which there are many ways of measuring, from 3D motions and forces that cause the motion and multi-segment motions, breaking up the foot into rear foot, midfoot, forefoot, with markers, without markers now, because markerless is really exciting, and inertial measurement units, and not the least of which, planar pressures is extremely useful, and as all of these measurement methods are in assessing foot function. And then how does this impact pathology? And that's ultimately where we want to go. If we're trying to help physicians and their patients, then can we do a better job diagnosing? Can we use the technology to prognose? Very important application is treatment planning. Can you use the technology to help you determine which treatments you want to do? And of course, as research tools. And then there's the commercialization process, which I'll talk a little bit about. Um, there's a sequence of grants, the SBIR phase 1. If you're successful in getting awarded that grant, either through NIH or NSF, National Science Foundation or National Institutes of Health, you could be invited to the I-Corps program, And that's actually how I met my colleague here, Christopher, because I was conducting interviews as part of the I-Corps program to see how different clinicians valued the technology and what would it be useful for them and their patients, and did it make sense? And then the SBIR Phase 2 is a much larger grant, which we're currently waiting for review of ours. It was sitting there in Bethesda during the government shutdown, and uh, so now they're back in action, and the folks are not furloughed, thank God, and they're back in NIH. So hopefully we'll get a positive review. And the Phase 2 grant really helps you go from your current level of development to commercialization, um, which will require some additional funding, usually in the private sector, maybe from an angel investor or a venture capitalist. There's a lot of names for these kinds of folks. But the difference is those folks will own a piece of your company as they invest in your company. And you might have seen the comfortable, familiar version of this if you ever watched a television show called Shark Tank. And they're vying for these influential, financially strong investors to be part of their company, and they're willing to give up a piece of their company for it. And that certainly makes a lot of sense. And when you get to that level where you're at the fork in the road and it comes time to make it or break it, you really need that investment. But what's exciting when you're starting out with government-based funding is it's non-dilutive, which means that um, the government doesn't care, NIH doesn't care, or NSF doesn't care to own any part of the technology we develop. They would like if the company was successful, if it hired more people in the US, and if those people paid taxes in the US. That they would like. So, that's kind of the thought process behind it. And as long as you can work with non-dilutive funding, you technically will still own 100% of your company. And then there's other concepts about intellectual property, and when you're talking about diagnostic and or invasive technologies, you need to have approval from the Federal Drug Administration, FDA, and even if it's not um, invasive, like the technology I'm going to show you is totally non-invasive, you still have to have it reviewed by the FDA and approved at some level, or even exempt, and that will still cost annual fees. So there's no way to not have some participation of the FDA if you're going to make a device or a pharmaceutical agent based on the evaluation or treatment of patients. And then, of course, manufacturing and marketing. So we'll try to touch on a little bit of these things so the process makes some sense. Um, So the first question, and I understand that most of you are physical therapists, so you've probably done this test before. What is first ray mobility and why is it important? So in the upper right-hand corner, you see my little cartoon of the foot bones, and then below it, you see how I'm holding the second, third, and fourth metatarsal heads and the first metatarsal head with my other hand, and I'm displacing, translating that structure up and down. And if I can move that structure up and down within plus or minus 8 millimeters, that would be normal first ray mobility. But if I exceed 8 millimeters, if I'm moving up and down 10, 15, 20 millimeters, then I have what's known as hypermobility. And what's interesting about first ray mobility is it's a very important function, possibly a means of connecting or acting as a transmission, so to speak, between the rear foot and the forefoot. It has a lot of important roles. And sure enough, in the literature, more than a dozen pathologies have been associated with abnormal first ray mobility. Whether you're hypomobile or hypermobile, there's been pathologies associated with the problem. And that's what actually got me excited about working in this area. Clinically, there isn't a good way to make this measurement reliably. And by reliable, I mean in a repeatable manner. So if I can't make the measure reliably because I'm just wiggling their foot with my fingers, and I don't know if I'm putting on 100 newtons of force or 20 newtons of force or the appropriate level of 50 newtons of force. And, if I'm making the measurement and one of you are making the measurement and if Chris was making the measurement, we could all get different answers because we can't really guarantee that we're doing the test in the same manner. So this is prime time for a biomedical engineer to say, I bet you there's a gizmo that'll do this. I bet you there's something we could design to do this. And so that's really what the inspiration was about. That was kind of the aha moment. And we even had one of our PhD students that both Raj and I were co-mentoring, who was training at Anglia Ruskin University in Essex, UK, and coming over to New York to spend time in my laboratory and then spending more time back in the UK laboratory doing a lot of computational modeling. And 6 publications later, and an excellent thesis, and a co-inventorship in the technology, Oliver did a wonderful job and now has his PhD. So, background-wise, hallux rigidus is got an incidence of a little under 4%. That's really osteoarthritis in the big toe joint, and it often is associated with first-right hypomobility. But actually, if you look at the potential translation over time, hallux, you don't wake up one day and you're in the morning and your big toe joint is stiff and painful, and it didn't just happen overnight. It's generally considered to be a longitudinal process that might start out with the normal joint, maybe some turf toe or some insult or injury, then maybe something the podiatric community refers to as functional hallux limitus, followed by hallux limitus, and then finally hallux rigidus, which is uh, less than 20 degrees of dorsiflexion motion, as opposed to the normal joint, which can dorsiflex 65 degrees or more. Uh, Over 80% of patients with hallux valgus, that's the commonly known as the bunion deformity, are hypermobile. So they have in excess of 8 millimeters of vertical translation. The hallux valgus deformity occurs in 23% of adults between 18 and 65 years of age. In the US, it is a fairly costly surgery, about 18,000 to 25,000 per foot, and is typically done 210,000 times each year. So it's very common. Um, and then the first, if you look at treating the hallux valgus or bunion deformity, of course, there's conservative treatments and foot orthoses that often can be helpful. But as that deformity progresses and gets into a greater transverse plane abductovarus deformity of your first ray, then unfortunately what's left are the surgical procedures. And as one of my surgeons has alerted me to at least a gazillion times, there's over 100 bunionectomies. How do you know which bunionectomy to do for which patient? And that goes along with treatment planning. So one of the more rigorous procedures is called the lapidus. It's a first metatarsal cuneiform fusion. It's considered the Clydesdale amongst the stable of horses and ponies in the world of bunionectomies. And other minimally invasive procedures and chevrons and so forth are more like the stallions and the smaller horses. But the very rigorous, super heavy duty procedure is the lapidus. And but one of the interesting things is not everybody needs a lapidus. Maybe only the more severe hallux valgus procedures. So this is where, again, measurement technology might be useful, and clinicians could use the measurement technology in their practice to build their own treatment algorithms if they had a user-friendly instrument to do it. So, in addition, I just want to quickly mention, and this is discussed a lot in my PubMed collection of articles, but foot type is a very important concept, and clinicians have simplified how complicated the foot really is. It's got 28 bones, 33 joints, 112 ligaments, controlled by 13 extrinsic and 26 intrinsic muscles. So it is a very, very mechanically complex structure, probably the most complex in the body, along with the spine. And we like to simplify it and say, well, there's low arched feet. We're going to call them pes planus. And there's normally arched feet. They're often called rectus. And there's high arched feet, and they're often called cavus. And the words kind of follow plane and cave, the actual shape of the foot. What's interesting is that investigators like Hilton Menz in Australia has very nicely published many times how planus individuals have a higher odds ratio of developing symptoms of disease, multiple diseases. It's an extremely common pathway to pathology. Both the hallux valgus and hallux rigidus patients tend to be planus more often than not. And hallux rigidus, being osteoarthritis in the first metatarsal phalangeal joint, is considered the most common degenerative joint disease in the foot and ankle. And the reason that's interesting is that, well, in the last 10, 20 years, we have finally developed a total ankle joint replacement to satisfy some of the disasters that go along with ankle osteoarthritis, as we've always been able to do for many, many decades with knee arthritis and hip arthritis. But the truth is, we don't have a total joint replacement for the first metatarsal phalangeal joint. We don't have good measurements for that joint, and we don't have very good analyses of what goes on in that joint. So we're really left, kind of behind the eight ball if that joint's destroyed, and osteophytes and joint space narrowing, uh, destruction of cartilage matrix and pain, ensue. We don't have good answers. So there's a lot of reasons to want to study the foot. And the way I like to do it is I like to make measurements of the structure and function of the foot. And I'm showing you here pictorially what my NIH protocol was. On the left is the arch height index, which measures arch height at the center of the dorsal aspect of the foot, normalized by the truncated foot length from heel to first metatarsal phalangeal joint. And these measurements are very reliable and accurate, and have been used to distinguish planus rectus and cavus feet remarkably well. And then in the middle is the new device. The map first is the first ray mobility and position device. And as your foot is placed in this technology, there's an actuator, which is the silver columns here. And underneath this black surface, there's a round black platen disc, which goes under the first metatarsal phalangeal joint. And next to it, the second metatarsal phalangeal joint is mechanically grounded. And the actuator puts exactly 50 newtons of force under the first metatarsal head, and it elevates till you're at the end of your slack in terms of ligamentous, windlass mechanism, and the like. And you will get a certain displacement, which will be normally mobile if you're under 8 millimeters. Maybe if you're only 0 to 2 millimeters, it would be hypomobile. But very common is to be over 10 millimeters, 20 millimeters, and be hypermobile. And this device beautifully documents that. This happens to be version 1, where the actuator is all controlled electromechanically via a USB link to a laptop with Arduino microcomputers inside of the two devices. Version 2 of this, which is done thanks to getting the SBIR Phase 1 grant, is a lot more advanced. There are no mechanical graticules anymore to read anything off. There's only linear variable displacement transducers in the device along with the actuator, so that we don't need a laptop as well, and it just communicates via Bluetooth to a tablet. And the tablet runs all the software in the form of an app, and tabulates all the results of all the measurements that it's made in sitting and standing for first ray mobility and position, left and right feet. And then on this right-hand side here is a device that we developed initially back at Temple University in Philadelphia, and we're continuing to improve upon it. And it's it measures rotational flexibility of the first metatarsophalangeal joint, which has been nicely shown to be reliable, but also it's shown to be very sensitive to uh, arthritic deformities in the first metatarsophalangeal joint compared to normal rotational flexibility. And then when this person walks, after getting all these structural measurements, we can nicely look at all the plantar pressures and see what's going on in the heel, the midfoot, and most importantly, under each of the five metatarsal heads and the hallux and lesser digits. And these pressures are color coded where the red and purple pressures are higher and the green and turquoise and dark blue are lower. So this is a nice little army of information to study on the human foot and to try to understand pathology. Um, Typically, this is what you might see in the lab if somebody was walking. All those little tripod legs have to do with the cameras that are looking at kinematics and kinetics if we wish to get that information. Um, the center of pressure concavity is very indicative of whether you have normal or overpronation or oversupination. And this is showing you the masked regions of plantar pressures, so you can distinguish what the loading is like in any particular anatomical portion of the foot. And it's a dynamic activity, so I made sure to put this little uh, blurb in here so you can kind of see from heel strike to toe off how this information is acquired. If you haven't seen them, Peter Bauer graphs, they are quite fun and they're quite good at documenting how the foot is being used. Um, so in particular, back to first ray and hypermobility, um, I had an NIH study back in 2009, and we published results in 2013. And what we noticed is that a lot of the flat-footed people had underloaded the first metatarsal head and overloaded the second and third. And they were flat-footed, and when I took the ratio of these forces and pressures, they could be 0.75, 0.6, but they were much lower than 1. And the ratio of the forces and pressures in a rectus well-aligned foot was close to 1. And so my theory there was, gee, although this is not intuitive that you're not using your first metatarsal head when you're flat-footed, you would think I've got to use it. Well, you don't have to use it. What if this is indicative of your hypermobility in your first ray? And so if you're hypermobile, maybe your first ray pops up out of the way and doesn't load the first metatarsal phalangeal joint and leaves the second and third metatarsal heads to do the work of bearing load to support weight during, progression. So with that theory, many years later, turn the clock forward, we finally now have a device that measures accurately and reliably first ray mobility. So I wanted to go after this question for quite some time. Here's a little quick blurb. It's fast. And notice this is the second generation device because there's no graticules anywhere. All of the transducers are hidden and they're all electronic. So, first order of business, if you're making a measurement and you designed a new instrument, the onus is on you to show that it's reliable. And we've already done and published work that showed that the manual clinical measurements are not reliable. Um, in fact, they have uh, interclass correlation coefficients as miserable as 0.06 by hand. So it turns out that our intra-rater reliability, how well you can repeat the measurement yourself, was a very nice high ICC value of 0.85, where 1 would be perfect. And the intra-rater reliability was 0.70, also respectable. So now we know we have a tool that we can use and get repeatable measurements from. Okay, why is this not advancing? Okay. We made a lot of other measurements about arch height index, the center pressure excursion index in pronation and gait, pressures under different areas of the forefoot in particular, the hallux, the first met, the second met, the ratio of first to second met pressures, and took a look at where there were differences. This little graph here shows that, as you'd expect, the rectus foot has the highest arch, um, besides cavus, and that planus feet are substantially lower than rectus feet. And if you had hallux valgus or hallux rigidus, you were more like a planus foot than a rectus foot, which is what we expected. Um, when we studied the data in terms of plantar pressures on the y-axis, we're looking here at the ratio of first to second metatarsal head pressures versus the first ray mobility measurements, and what you see is this inverse relationship, a negative relationship, and it's basically saying the more mobile my first ray gets, 10 millimeters, 15 minutes, 20 millimeters, 25 millimeters, the lower this ratio becomes. So there is a link here between the mobility of the first ray and the function of the foot in terms of the plantar loading. It looks like first ray mobility drives plantar loading, which I didn't appreciate many years ago, but I'm starting to appreciate now. But this is not the whole story. Yes, it's a significant relationship. The p value is under 0.05, but the R value, the correlation coefficient is, 0.38. It's nothing great. There's a lot of scatter in this data. So we then decided, well, maybe there's an interaction between first ray mobility and arch height, foot type. And sure enough, when we started to look at these values, just focus maybe on the peak pressure under the first med head, and we included all the arch height and first ray mobility measures along with some anthropometrics, and we got a higher R value of 0.55, also significant. And in fact, all of these are significant relationships. And we started to realize that this might be more of a multivariate problem as opposed to a univariate, meaning we can't describe all the intricacies in this complex structure, the foot and ankle, with just one measurement. But first ray mobility is an important measurement. And in conjunction with arch height index, you've got foot type and first ray function together. Now you're starting to predict what the foot does when it moves, when it's bearing load on the ground. So this is now starting to look like we have some good science and that the instrument may be of clinical value. Also, these analyses were no longer just about rectus and planus asymptomatic healthy feet, but they included our cohorts of hallux valgus and hallux rigidus feet, which are harder to study as we learned. So as a case study, here's an individual preoperative that has hallux valgus, and he's got hypermobility. The first ray mobility is 12 millimeters as measured by the MAP first device. There's no loading under the hallux and lots of loading under the second and third metatarsal heads and also under the hallux. So this is one of those feet that we're just expecting. It's flat foot, they're overpronating, but they're not loading the first metatarsal head. So we're expecting this hypermobile flat foot to either be involved in the initiation or progression or both of hallux valgus deformity. And here's the hallux valgus deformity. So postoperatively, the surgeon elected to do the lapidus, the more rugged procedure. He dropped the first ray mobility 2 millimeters from 12 to 10. And now the foot does bear load under the first metatarsal head more symmetrically with the second and third. And it is not overloading the hallux. These are all good results from the standpoint of the surgeon. This would be a home run for converting that foot into this foot from a functional perspective. And I just wanted you to see it because we're actually doing this study now where we're looking at a group of patients treated with the lapidus bunionectomy and comparing them to a group of patients treated with the MIS chevron, which is a much lighter duty procedure preferred by a lot of patients and physicians because you're up and moving in a couple of weeks, whereas the Lapidus can take 4 to 6 weeks for healing before you're completely comfortable loading it unassisted. So just wanted to show you what those results look like. In terms of interpretation, um, there's greater first ray hypermobility when you see those smaller force and pressure ratios under the first and second med heads. And these hypermobile first rays do not fully support the load and a in comparison to a non-hypermobile first ray. But we don't believe this phenomena is entirely the responsibility of first ray mobility. We think that there's an interaction with foot type and first ray mobility, which is why we're recommending the combination of these measurements for foot structure to be done. And we also noticed that as the second metatarsal head force increases, the first metatarsal head force decreases, while hulutional force may increase. So the observations of the data are very useful. We've discussed this with 108 stakeholders or experts in the field, of which Christopher was one of, in our interviews. We talked to a gentleman who's a podiatric physician, an MD, peripheral vascular surgeon, and a PhD, David Armstrong, and his career has been really booming in the world of diabetes. And he was complimenting us with this, comment that I decided to put in quotes, that the MAP First device is a way to measure first ray mobility, manage associated diseases that is pragmatic, novel, and clinically important. The number one location for diabetic foot ulcers is between the hallux, and the number two location is beneath the second metatarsal phalangeal joint. And so he agreed with me that this has many more applications than the orthopedic applications I'm showing you in hallux valgus and hallux rigidus. And we are going to look at each of those pathologies one by one and see what the true value of this information is for clinicians and patients. So to wrap things up, you have to consider the market opportunity. There's a picture on the left, by the way, of the Samsung tablet, and you can see the resulting data tabulated there, and the version 2 device. What we're proposing now in our SBIR phase 2 is shown here in more of a drawing, and it's in essence the combination of arch height index, first ray mobility, and rotational flexibility at the first metatarsal phalangeal joint, all fully automated and done, all these measurements made in under 2 minutes. So that's the goal, because clinicians cannot waste their time. They've got to get things done quickly. You've got to go through this process of understanding, developing a business plan, understanding who your market is, and how many cases there are that might be affected by your technology. And one of the things that was interesting is that 30 to 40% of bunions can recur in a year, and that is a greater than $1 billion waste of money that's avoidable if we did the bunionectomy properly in the first case, if we chose the right procedure for the right patient and managed all the ancillary issues, then the recurrence of bunion wouldn't occur, and we'd save a lot of money there. But in terms of market sizing, the total available market, when you include not only the orthopedic applications, but other medical applications, as well as orthotics and shoe gear and other biomechanical and diagnostic things, we estimate to be about $1 billion. The addressable market, based on a sale price of $5,000 per device, per right and left footed device, with all of the measures of foot structure and the tablet and software, we anticipate from a portion of practices that would be early adopters that there may be 104 million in of addressable market, and of that group, maybe 24 million would be potentially sold in the first year, along with ancillary funding related to the software upgrades and hardware. What's the word I'm looking for? Maintenance contracts, that kind of stuff, to make sure if anything breaks, you fix it and all of that stuff. And we estimated crudely that the global opportunity is probably 5 times these numbers for the US. So this, I believe, is pretty much all that needs to be said. There's some references, and if I think this might be a good time to open it up to questions and to if there's anything that is in particular, um, you know, concerning or any comments at all, that would be fantastic to hear.
Thank you, Howard. Great job. And so, is this out in HSS or is this in any physician's hands at the moment?
No, it's only in our laboratory at the moment. Once we're done with the phase 2 work, then the goal is to make it commercially available. And in fact, during the phase 2 work, we're going to identify some key opinion leaders and get some uh, pre-prototype devices in their hands, just so that we get that experience as well. But at this point, we're the only people who have used it. We only have one pair of the devices, so we need to get a few more cookies in the cookie jar and build a few more devices.
Makes sense. Yeah. And, looking at it from a physical therapist perspective, dealing with patients who might be considering a bunionectomy or some sort of, significant intervention, being able to refer to someone who has access to a device like that certainly could help us in helping them make the right decisions on their care.
Sure. And it's not even that expensive. It's when you consider, a planar pressure measurement system, now we're talking a good one like from Neville in Munich, Germany, that I was showing you that we use is an $80,000 to $100,000 instrument. You can buy lesser expensive ones. There are some made in the US, but we prefer this particular instrument because of its quality, and accuracy, and repeatability. So everything that we use in the lab, we've personally tested. And so, we selected that equipment. And NASA actually uses Novell equipment in space applications, trying to get an astronaut to survive the trip to Mars and to do the right exercises that would be required to maintain the bone mineral density to survive that longer trip in zero gravity. And I always get a kick out of when NASA decides to use technology that we don't make in America, but they decided to use the German pressure measurement system as well. So it's another vote of confidence for me.
That's great. And so clinicians obviously are constantly encountering problems that they want to try to solve and may even have ideas for ways to try to solve it or devices that may work, but don't have the background or the resources necessarily to even pursue that. So for those who may have ideas like that or encounter problems like that, would your recommendation be to reach out to you or to people like you, or what would you think that sort of
My
path from
recommendation is,
inspiration to execution might look like for someone on this call?
yeah, I'm happy to take any call or email, but I would also recommend reach out to Chris, reach out to other people with this background and expertise. Um, the entrepreneurial spirit, you should never squash it. If you have a new idea or a good idea, run with it. And there are several PTs that have patents at HSS because of that entrepreneurial spirit, and there's some that are working on some right now that I can't talk about because they haven't filed yet. And it's exciting to see, when I watch a physical therapist. I'll give you a teaser for any of you who do pediatrics. You may have evaluated and treated infants with torticollis. And the classic measurement is with a manual goniometer. So you have a physical therapist and a parent holding a squirmy baby with a manual goniometer, and you're going to try to get a good measurement. you know, to understand if the neck is moving in, the side to side bending in forward or rotational directions properly. And, then of course the pediatric therapist knows exactly what to do with their great training. But we're going to make that problem a lot simpler. We're going to make it really straightforward, for the therapists and the parents so they don't have to worry about all these other things at the same time. And for me, it's a lot of fun to watch, and see, well, how can we make that better? And when you have therapists with 10, 20, 30, 40 years experience, they know what's wrong. They know they've been doing this for so long. They know what could be better. I mean, I'm happy to talk to anybody who'd like to talk to me, and frankly, I would probably learn more from you with all of your clinical expertise than you'll learn from me. But I can certainly show you the path that we went on.
Thank
I would echo
you.
that too. And just sorry to interrupt, but Ben, I think you're
No,
exactly right. It's clinicians that identify, what are the pain points, what are the solutions, what are the potential solutions that are out there. That's so critical to the whole process, right? And Howard sort of alluded to the customer discovery and sort of all of that process, and really, there's entire, structural courses set up, funded by the government that support innovation, that force you to do customer discovery for exactly that reason. You have to go to, not just one, but 100, right? Clinicians, stakeholders from different areas, different, points of view, to sort of get that feedback to find the right fit for things, right? And sort of iterate around, like, how can this work out in the field? And I think it just sort of it underscores exactly the point that we all know, that, right, it's being out there with your hands on in the field that gives you the insight for where all this stuff comes from and where solutions are going to come from. So it's a key piece.
I love it. Yeah, and it's, a common theme that I'm seeing across the country, especially with those who are really accomplished in clinical education and who have gone a long way with residency or fellowship training, that there comes a point where they want a bit more control over their time, a bit more control over their financial opportunity, a bit more control over the things they're most passionate about. And the idea of helping to innovate on the equipment side, on the assessment or intervention side, isn't necessarily something that's come up a lot. Often it's, well, maybe I'll teach, or maybe I'll start my own business or create a side hustle. So that the concept, breaking that sort of idea out and saying, hey, there's other PTs and other clinicians in the world doing this. If you've
Mhm.
got a good idea, you've got resources to lean on and ideas to hopefully share. That's a pretty cool idea. I think liberating for those maybe who haven't thought of that.
Exactly, what you're suggesting, I think, is happening more so in the last decade than ever. Um, on the little island in the East River that I happen to live on, Roosevelt Island, a high tech university started, and that it was a combination of Cornell University, which is known for its technology, and Technion, which is the Israeli version of MIT, and they're known for their technology. So Cornell Tech is its name, and that campus has no undergraduates in it. It's only masters, PhDs, and postdocs. And you have two advisors. One advisor is about the science and the equations and make sure your experiments are right. And the other advisor is from business, who understands what it takes to make a good business plan and to get the entrepreneurial spirit in the direction of a spin-off company. And so that advisor is making sure your IP is right and your business plan is right. And both of those advisors follow you through the process. So if you want to call it anything, it's a university for training entrepreneurs. And
It's
and so
amazing.
there's more and more of that going on. Stanford was always thinking like that. And you'll see more and more of it. And the universities do something that is smart, which a lot of corporations don't do. Corporations have you sign away your patent rights, and you're only an inventor in name, but not in any financial regard in any way. But when you work for a university or an academic health science center, they often have royalty or patent sharing policies where the inventors share in the royalties. And so if you happen to invent something that's really useful and it like you invent the next best thing to Coband or something, then it's you're going to wind up doing well in your personal cookie jar, besides the excitement of inventing something.
Love it. Well, we have reached the end of our session. Any parting thoughts, either from you, Howard, or from you, Chris, for the attendees who not only came online, but are also watching this recording?
I'll just jump in and say thanks for the opportunity. And, it's always great to talk innovation. I think the PT field, as we chatted a bit before everyone got on the call, and just, how much opportunity there is across the PT field, residencies, fellows, to innovate. And, it's a great process. It's a ton of fun. And I think, you mentioned there's career value that comes from it. And a lot of that's internal too. It's fulfilling to sort of see something move forward. So, and happy to
Wonderful.
help anytime.
Howard, any
Thank,
final thoughts on your end?
thanks for the invitation, folks. It was a lot of fun. And anybody who happens to be in the New York City area and wants the 25-cent tour here at HSS, I'm happy to give you the tour.
Thank you both for your expertise. Thank you all for attending. I will be sending a follow-up email with their contact information so you can reach out directly to them with any questions. Stay tuned for the next Residency Hot Topics.
Thanks, everyone.